my great pleasure to welcome you to the Center for International Policy Studies. My name is Rita Abrahamson and I have the great honor of directing SIPS. It's my pleasure today to welcome you to SIPS, and on behalf of SIPS and the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs is Carlton, who's co-sponsoring this talk. We have the great honor of welcoming you to Wendy Wong's talk. Wendy is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and she has her PhD from the University of California in San Diego, which I'm sure she misses occasionally when she keeps on very easy to hold. But at least it's a nice sunny day. Apart from that, Wendy, as most of you probably know, she is very well known for her work on NGOs, and I think it's fair to say that she has been really pretty much at the forefront of academic work that treats NGOs not simply as kind of nice, benevolent actors that seek to do good, but to take NGOs, and international NGOs in particular, seriously as political actors that exist in a very complex and a very competitive environment. So her first book was called Internal Affairs, and it raised the question of why some NGOs were more politically salient than others, and came to a conclusion, to summarize and simplify, that this had a lot to do with how they were organized internally. So looking at NGOs and then why they become influential, we can't only look at them as doing good, but looking how they are made up as separate or different of actors. She's also written a lot of great articles and book chapters on various issues to do with NGOs, humanitarianism, non-state actors in general. So I'm not going to go through all of that, simply to encourage you to read it, but most of all today she's here to talk about her new book, The Authority Trap, fresh off the press from Cornell University Press. I forgot to say, by the way, that her previous book was also with Cornell University Press, and it won an award for an outstanding book of the year in 2014 for books on NGOs and non-profit organizations. So there are great expectations to this book as well. I haven't had a chance to read it yet. I look forward to doing so, but from the title, what we can infer is that it really challenges us to think hard about those NGOs that we think about as powerful or leading NGOs, and about how, in order to remain powerful and leading in terms of influence in international affairs, they may actually have to modify and adapt their behavior in ways that are surprising. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Wendy Wong to SIPS, University of Ottawa.
Thank you, Rita. That was such a lovely introduction. And thank you to both universities for having me visit, and especially SIPS for organizing this whole trip. It's been very painless, so I think that's good job. Well done. I'm here to talk about a book that I wrote with Sarah Stroup, as Rita alluded to in her remarks, called The Authority Trap. I'll talk a little bit about why we wrote the book first before I try to then cram all of what we wrote into 30 minutes, or at least a significant part of it, so that you all have a good sense of what we were trying to do here. So we wrote the book because for the past couple of decades now, I think it's been pretty clear, at least from the research and also from policymakers' perspectives, that NGOs, or international NGOs, so INGOs rather, are seen as having some kind of influence in global politics. But what that means is not always necessarily clear. Some people call it power, some people call it authority, or effects, or any number of other things. And so what we really wanted to do was to establish some sort of way that we can talk about INGOs and global politics and their influence from a generalizable and systematic perspective. So the goal was twofold. One was to show that we can measure what INGO influence is. We call this authority in the book. And also then to demonstrate why this matters, and outside of specific issue areas. So typically, folks who are interested in INGOs look at them from their work on environmentalism, or their work on human rights, or relief and development, and then talk about their influence in these specific areas. And we wanted to break our analysis out of that set of criteria. We also wanted to show that INGOs are actually quite a diverse group of actors. And so This is not a typical, what we see as a typical response to INGOs in both international relations and also from a policy perspective, which is, to summarize it quite simply, add INGOs and stir to see what you get. So we're really interested in which NGOs get added and why and when, and a host of other questions that we're hoping to answer with this book. So the core arguments there are a number of them, but let me just quickly run through them here. So first, we find and we argue that authority is exceedingly rare for INGOs, that it's very hard to find INGOs that actually have authority in international relations, and that most INGOs do not have it. And that this is something that we find empirically, as I'll talk about. The second point is that of those that have authority, there are some that have lots of it. So we're talking about a very select group of INGOs in global politics. You probably have heard of a lot of them, and there's a reason for that. And they're the ones that you will hear about over and over again, because these are the leading INGOs in global politics. They have a lot of authority. That being said, all INGOs are caught in what we call the authority trap. The authority trap works to constrain the behavior of INGOs because of the nature of authority in global politics. And the nature in particular of INGO authority as we look at it in the book. So the authority trap constrains the way that INGOs strategize in their interactions with others in global politics, both those that have authority, and especially those that are what we call leading INGOs, but also those that do not have authority. And we further argue that leading INGOs tend to go for what we call vanilla victories. Now, just a quick caveat, because in other presentations people have commented on this, it's not a pejorative term. Vanilla simply means that it is widely palatable. That vanilla mostly is something that we use to describe not super exciting, but also not negative, right? It just is something that is widely acceptable. So just to let you guys, to be clear on that, okay? It's definitely not a judgment of the normative content of the work of INGOs. So I'm going to try to do this in about 30 minutes. We'll see how successful I am. First, I'm going to be talking about what authority is. Okay, so I'll talk about our working definition and how we think about it. Then I'll talk about the measurement of authority and what we find. All right. I'll talk through the implications of that in terms of looking at specifically INGO corporate relationships. And I'll talk about how INGOs choose strategies. And the three strategies we talk about in the book are collaboration, condemnation, and competition. So I'll only be talking about collaboration in my remarks. I'm happy to talk about the other ones in the Q&A. And finally, the implications of the argument. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to be talking about a lot of other contributions in this quite vast field. So if you do want to talk about the work in context, I'm more than happy also to contextualize that in the questions. So what is authority? Now, I know many of us in this room probably spend a lot of time thinking about this, so hopefully none of this is too aggressively new, but we do want to offer our perspective on what this means for the study of INGOs and global politics. So authority is inherently social, and when we define authority, we're talking about deference. So deference means surrendering judgment to another. So an actor A will have authority over actor B if B defers to A. So it's an inherently social activity. It means that one actor is saying that another actor's decision-making is good for them, right? It's allowing others to make judgments on your behalf. Now, with that comes two things, the right to act. So if I have authority, I'm able to act in another actor's eyes. I'm able to take action. And it also comes with the right to be heard. So the right to be heard isn't just that I have the right to speak, but that when I speak, even if you disagree with me, you allow me to be a legitimate option, or at least an option that you might want to respond to. But it's the right to be heard and to be an option for consideration. Now, we talk about the difference between in and an authority. So when you're in authority, this is the classic IR way to think about authority. It's really the political science way to think about authority, which is rational legal authority, right? So you have, if you're the best example, of course, is the nation state. If you're a state, you are in authority, and the things that you say carry legitimacy, and if anyone crosses what you say, you have the right to then punish. So we think about this typically as rightful rule. Now, INGOs do not have the capacity to do most of these things I just said. So they do have authority, though. They are seen as an authorities. Now, being an authority means that there's some quality about an actor, whether that's virtue, knowledge, experience, capacity. You can think of any number of reasons why someone might defer to another actor. And when that happens, they're seen as legitimate by some actor, and therefore they're seen as an authority. And we think of INGOs as an authorities. They're certainly not in authorities in international relations, at least most of the time. So when we think about that, authority is certainly earned. There's some sort of instrumental or value agreement that an audience, D, uses to evaluate the virtues of A or the qualities of A, to think about whether they deserve authority, right? So it's a decision, but it's a decision once made that becomes automatic but not unreasoned. So there are definitely ways that you can lose authority before others. You can lose authority before various audiences. It's not permanent, but it's also not something that's constantly in flux. So it's pretty durable in that sense. And that's why we distinguish our position from persuasion, which is another way that others have thought about authority. The INGOs that we're investigating have established authority. They're not constantly trying to convince others to agree with them. Once they're seen as legitimate, they're seen as authorities, that pretty much stays with them, and there's not constant negotiation in that sense. Okay, so I've already mentioned audiences. Audiences are important to us because they're the actor Bs in our story, right? So they're the ones that are conferring authority to INGOs. And this is the crux of where INGOs get their influence from in global politics. Now, audiences might see INGOs as principled, as experts, as capable. They might like the fact that INGOs are well networked. There are lots of different reasons for why an audience might appreciate an INGO. In fact, they might even like the fact they disagree with them and that INGO offers some sort of straw man for them to argue with. Okay? But no matter what, if they're recognizing that INGO and they're speaking to that INGO or citing that INGO's work, that signals the authority of that INGO, because it signals to others that this INGO has the right to be heard. Okay? So audiences are really important in our story. Authority can be conveyed negatively or positively. And what we do in trying to compare INGOs and their authority, the differences in authority between them, is we aggregate authority across audiences. So the logic is the more audiences that defer to a particular INGO, the more authority that INGO has. Okay? And I'll explain how that works later in the talk. But the audiences that are important to us in our book are states, corporations, other INGOs, and something called the global public. Okay, so these are the audiences of concern that we look at. So to define what leading INGOs are, these are the ones that some of these might be familiar to you in terms of just encountering them in the media and so forth. These are the ones that have authority before multiple audiences. Okay? And I'll be more specific about that when I talk about some of our empirics. Most INGOs you've probably not heard of because they don't have authority before any audience. Or they might have authority before an audience to which you're not part of. Right? But most INGOs do not have any authority at all. Right? So that's something that we establish in the empirical chapters of the book. Now, one question is, okay, well, yeah, most INGOs don't have authority, but maybe they don't want it, right? Maybe not all INGOs want to be what we might call authority maximizers. They don't care, they're just doing their work, they don't need authority. We assume in the book that the great majority of international NGOs want authority. And they want this authority because it helps them achieve their goals. So whether you're working on human rights or humanitarian causes, if no one is listening to you or funding you or you don't get any coverage on your work, it's very difficult to sustain that work. And so our assumption is authority is not an ends. It's not that INGOs just want authority because, but it's because they want to do their work well, or they want to be able to do their work. So there's not really a way to think about the optimal amount of authority that an INGO has, right? But generally speaking, we would expect that international NGOs would seek opportunities to become authorities before different relevant audiences. And perhaps not all of them want to become leading INGOs, but certainly being authoritative before multiple audiences is not seen as a bad thing. All right, so let me talk a little bit about so chapter 3 is where we discuss the general patterns of authority of INGOs around in global politics. And the other substantive chapters of the book, 4, 5, and 6, talk about the cases, specifically in relationships, the dyadic relationships between INGOs and other actors. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about our general patterns. So we took a random sample of INGOs registered in 4 places. We did the US, UK, and UN first, and then we added Canada at a later stage in the project. These are all count data, right? So we have six different indicators of audience deference that we look at. So, and they span across 4 different audiences. So we have the public, states, other INGOs, and corporations. So we're looking at different audiences that could potentially be deferring to INGOs, and these are really important audiences for INGOs to do their work. So overall, what we find is that most INGOs get 0 mentions. There are no events reported at all of their activity before these audiences. So just to illustrate, because we do this for every single audience that I mentioned here, for media data, over half of INGOs just get nothing between 2010 and 2012. 96% of those news mentions go to just 10% of the INGOs in our sample. So it's not just that most INGOs are not getting anything, it's also that those that get mentioned a lot are very few, right? So this is a random sample of the average INGO in these 4 sets. So now we know what the average experience of an INGO is. And we wanted to know, well, we know that leading INGOs or getting deference before multiple audiences is not the experience of the average NGO. So let's try to figure out if we can actually select on the likelihood of becoming a leading INGO. So we set up another data set with just leading INGOs, or those that we think have the biggest chance of becoming leading INGOs. So this is a list that is of only Anglophone organizations, and we base this on 2 different factors. One is financial size. So given the research on INGOs, we know that if you have a lot of financial resources, you're more likely to be able to be successful in what you do. So we selected this list based on financial size and also incoming network ties. This is a signal for the likelihood that these INGOs might be able to generate some sort of authority before different audiences. And we used 2 indicators each for 3 audiences, so looking at states, their INGO peers, and the public. And to determine whether an INGO is a leading INGO, we use 2 different ways to think about topness, I guess, to rank them. The first is appearance in the top 10 for any one of these 6 indicators that I mentioned. And then the other is actually just looking at normalized scores across all of these 6 criteria to see how well these INGOs are scoring, and just picking the top ones. So I'm going to show you a few of the figures that we have in the book, looking at this to give you a sense of, even among the most likely, we're seeing clumping around certain INGOs in terms of their authority. So this is just looking at the media mentions data again from 2010 to 2012. And what you see here is there's a fairly steep drop-off after about the 12th organization on here, which is, I think it's MSF or around MSF. So just to give you some illustration, I'm going to pick on 3 organizations to talk about throughout these slides. So the first is Salvation Army scores very high on media mentions. Salvation Army is not really an INGO that most INGO scholars look at. Okay, so that was a surprising finding. We also looked at Greenpeace. Greenpeace tends to be thought of as a media darling. It's not a surprise. It's pretty high up there. And MSF, or Doctors Without Borders, actually scores fairly low on this measure. Okay, so I talked to someone at MSF about this. This is pre-Ebola, which is 2014, right? But still, it's getting surprisingly few media mentions compared to the way its reputation, or the weight of its reputation. So this was actually a surprising finding. But Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch at the top of the pile, Oxfam, these are all organizations we know have the reputation for being media savvy. So it shows in the way that they're ranked. Now, to give you a sense of how many times each of our 45 INGOs end up in any top 10 list across these 6 indicators, you see that, again, there's lots of variation, and basically half of our sample is not appearing in the top 10 of any of our indicators. Once again, Salvation Army does very well. There's MSF, kind of in the middle of the pack of those that are scoring high across the top 10, and Greenpeace. Okay, so these are the sort of 3 organizations I wanted to point out here, because there's actually quite a bit of variation in terms of the times that an INGO is actually scoring well across our indicators as well, which gives us a sense of how difficult it is to actually have authority before multiple audiences in global politics. And here's our table of leading INGOs. Okay, here's the empirical punchline, right? Once again, we have the 3 INGOs of interest. The first column, the first column shows the normalized scores across the 6 indicators. So a top score would be 6. So what you see here is that many INGOs are not scoring remarkably high, even if they're having authority before that audience. Right? So it's really incredibly hard to even have authority before a single audience. And the normalized scores show just how hard it is to actually gain that sort of deference from different audiences. And the far right column shows how many audiences that are deferring to them. Because we do have 6 indicators, of course, and there's 2 indicators per audience. So we wanted to also tell you how many audiences that actually translates to. So leading INGOs as a category means deference before multiple audiences, and here's our list of about 14 INGOs that we can say with certainty are leading INGOs according to our criteria. Okay? So what does that mean? What we really find is that there's clear differentiation in authority across audiences between INGOs. Okay? There's definitely INGOs that do really well before certain audiences, and some that do terribly before other audiences. It's very rare to find an INGO that we would say is an all-around good performer, okay? As you can see from the normalized scores. Most INGOs, even among the most likely list, do not have authority, so it becomes really, it was crystal clear with the average INGO, and I think it becomes even more stressed with our leading INGO findings. And the very few have authority before 2 or more audiences. This also means that authority is both elusive but clumps at the top. Right? So if you are, it seems that only certain INGOs are attracting authority from any audience in international relations. So those are the key findings from that. So I want to talk a little bit about why this matters, right? Because this matters because of the way that authority works. So if authority is audience-based, if it's based on audience deference, given that the ones that have it want to maintain it, and the only way to maintain that is to actually make sure that you continue appealing to those audiences, right? You don't do anything that's completely drastic that would make you lose authority before a particular audience, or that you would be seen to favor maybe the interests of states over that of corporations, for example. Okay, so Given the nature of authority, those who have it want to maintain it, and that traps them. It traps leading INGOs into making more moderate claims, more moderate demands, because they do have authority before 2 or more audiences, and those audiences often have very divergent interests and values. So this causes them to seek those vanilla victories I mentioned before. Doing this not only helps them maintain authority, but also helps them secure resources and support from different sources. Other INGOs, the INGOs that are not leading INGOs, do not have any authority. And so while that unconstrains their strategies and they can do more things, it does mean that most of the time they're still going unheard. And so their activities are not getting before the audiences that matter for global politics. So this shapes the way that INGOs strategize. And so I'm going to be talking about collaboration, but there is also condemnation and competition. And of course, leading INGOs and other INGOs make different calculations based on the logic outlined here as to how they pursue these 3 different options when they interact with different actors in global politics. So I'm going to talk about INGOs and corporations because I think this is the relationship that is most often seen as adversarial. And they're often seen as the exact opposites of one another for any number of reasons I don't want to get into, but this is something that we don't expect INGOs and corporations to be friends. Okay? But it is, in fact, INGOs vary considerably in the way they think about corporations. So some of them do see them as friends, or at least potential allies. In earlier drafts, I called them frenemies, right? Because that's what it is. It's that they can mutually use each other for some sort of benefit in the way that they act in politics. So INGOs vary considerably. Their status shapes how they strategically think about this. And so we do expect leading INGOs to be more collaborative than other INGOs because, again, they're trying to maintain authority before different audiences in global politics, and the corporate audience is one of those. So what they want from that is, of course, both gaining and maintaining corporations as an audience. And corporations also see benefit to working with INGOs. There's this halo effect of working with, of course, your principled opposite, right? It's good, and the more authority, the bigger the halo, because more people know who you're working with. And we also observe a sequencing effect. Right? And that's something that makes sense. So at the beginning of an initiative, you would expect leading INGOs to take charge. Corporations would find more benefit in working with them to start new things. But once those things are begun, you would expect to see other INGOs also having an opportunity to get in there and to work on some of the finer details. So I like this example because it gives me the opportunity to talk about Walmart. Walmart's not something we talk about a whole lot in IR, but it's a very important corporation, as all of us know. It's an American corporation, but it has huge global impact. It's all over the world, and not only that, it basically affects global supply chains in ways that are, that we commonly don't think about very much in IR. But actually, because of the scale of Walmart, it's a huge global phenomenon, even if it's an American corporation at heart. So as you all know, also Walmart's hugely controversial, and in 2005, the CEO unveiled some new sustainability practices that they're continuing to refine now. But this is really the watershed moment where they decided we're gonna go for sustainability, and sustainability not just environmentally but also socially and politically. So they teamed up with a number of universities to launch the Sustainability Consortium, or TSC. The TSC has membership, is basically a membership organization. Corporations are, for the most part, the members, but INGOs can be members, and academic partners can also be members of this consortium. And it got early support from WWF and CARE, both of whom are leading INGOs along our criteria. So they had the support of 2 leading INGOs very early on. Now, just to mention, just give this a little bit of context too, the corporations that are in the TSC are largely the biggest suppliers in the world of products that we consume, but also of Walmart. So we're talking about Coca-Cola, Johnson & Johnson, Unilever, Bayer, Disney, all sorts of big names out there. And they're even now, since the publication of the book, Amazon has also joined and Walgreens as big retailers and competitors to Walmart. So that's actually an interesting development. Okay, so what does the TSC do? Its purpose was to define and assess the sustainability of all of the products in Walmart stores without hurting anyone's bottom line. Okay? We're talking about basically 120 to 150,000 products in any given Walmart store. So this is a huge task, and what they basically come up with are some working groups that are composed of the corporate and INGO and academic members within the TSC. So they get together and define key hot spots for improvement. So places where there could be sustainable practices built into the production process. They develop these key performance indicators, KPIs, that are then distributed to members as places where they can start becoming more sustainable. So members including Walmart. When they look at a product, now when we think about this, and initially when they launched this, the way that they thought about it was, if you go into a store and you see Tide detergent, it would have like a green happy face or something, right? Or it would say, this score is a 7.9 out of 10 for sustainability, something like that, to help consumers. Thus far, what the TSC has been doing is writing short reports that help identify places where a big category of products, so not Tide detergent, but household cleaning supplies, okay, could improve their sustainability practices. So in theory, this could eventually inform consumer practices, but to date, what they have are about 110 product categories that include a lot of different types of things that then are not direct implications on how people purchase or even how companies are producing these products. Now, is the TSC a vanilla victory, right? And on the one hand, this is a huge initiative made by a huge retailer involving most of the global brands that we all know, and even some of its competitors, to try to improve sustainability practices. And in fact, it had the support of WWF and CARE, who both joined the board in 2011. And that board membership rotates, so they're not always on it, but they were initially there. Other NGOs that were involved, and one is still very heavily involved, is the Environmental Defense Fund and also the Nature Conservancy. So also, pretty big names in environmentalism. Now, INGOs see this, of course, as not only an opportunity for future collaboration with Walmart and other suppliers, but also to have leverage or have some sort of influence on the practices of huge companies that we all have heard of and know of. But one of the big hang-ups right now with the way the TSC works is that these hotspots, as I mentioned before, are decided in working groups that are composed of both corporate and INGO and academic interests, which means that a lot of the stuff that happens has to balance both the science, like they're using life cycle assessments to help them understand the sustainability of their products, with basically usability. Is it practical to do the things that science is recommending? And from this conversation, they determine the hotspots, and they all have, it's consensual, right? It's a single list of things that have to be agreed upon by everyone in that working group that has effects for all the members in the TSC. So that's one thing in terms of thinking about the matchup between science versus usability. And the other thing is that the TSC is non-binding. So actually membership in the TSC does not mean that they're pledging to become more sustainable. It simply means for many of the companies they're joining so they can be part of the debate about what the sustainability hotspots are. So the TSC in some ways can be seen as a very dramatic change, and in other ways, in practical terms, it's not necessarily making huge waves on the way that global supply chains are working, at least with suppliers to Walmart or members of the TSC. All right, so in this account, leading INGOs and other INGOs have been collaborating with the TSC. And they haven't actually been very vocal critics. So those that have joined the TSC have not really said in public what it is I just said. There hasn't been a lot of condemnation, unlike in other cases we look at, like the UN Global Compact. Right? So it's, my sense is that the condemnation is too risky at this point because of the number of companies that they have access to. Is condemning them at this point condemning the TSC rather would not be a good strategy. So collaboration is really how leading INGOs involved in this project in particular have chosen to act. But this comes at a cost, right? So some of them see this as short-term pain for long-term gain. They're really hoping that even if in the short run, it doesn't seem like these corporations are doing a whole lot, in the long run this will change their mindset and the way that they choose to do business. And some also voice this is better than nothing, even if it's not great at this point. Walmart is also a big target, and so we know that INGOs go for, when they do work with corporations or condemn corporations, they're going for big targets, right? Brands that matter, brands that people know. And so whether INGOs choose to collaborate or condemn in this situation, Walmart would be a logical target for them. So it's an interesting case to sort of keep tabs on. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the implications of the trap for INGOs. Okay. So as I said from the outset, the authority trap is about both affecting other INGOs and leading INGOs, right, and their behavior. So we focus on the leading INGOs' behavior because they have the most authority in global politics and because it's important to explain why it is that a lot of times they're actually quite moderate in their demands and in their asks. Now, other INGOs are not constrained as much in their strategies, but they're also not as paid attention to, and so this is something that, it's not that it doesn't matter, but it's that the consequences of their choices are far smaller in terms of authority. So the big point, of course, is that INGOs are not monolithic in the way that they approach global politics, that the way they build relationships with other actors is not a singular strategy, and that they have lots of different ways that they can do things if they chose to. The other thing is that the trap, although it's a trap, it's not impenetrable, right? It's not determinative. But this is just a way to think about the actions and choices of INGOs and the tendency for how they act. And there are, of course, ways that we can think about INGOs stepping outside of the trap or being able to sort of overcome it in different situations. So there are definitely opportunities for more transformative demands when the context around the INGOs shift, right? But this is generally, what we're trying to demonstrate is that INGOs are different in terms of composition, choice, and constraints, and that it's not easy being a leading INGO, it's not easy being another INGO either. Beyond the book, we're pretty convinced that this is not unique to INGOs in terms of behavior, that other political actors also face these sorts of things. And in the interest of maintaining authority before different audiences, may make more moderate claims or may have to act in ways they otherwise would not act, but for concerns about maintaining authority. So in some ways, we're normalizing INGO politics by not making it extraordinary, because INGOs are different from other political actors in that they do have explicit value or principled statements, but that doesn't make their politics abnormal, right? So we're trying to normalize the way we think about INGOs. And another implication of this, and this is something actually Sarah and I have been thinking about a lot, is what makes a good INGO? What is a good INGO, and to whom? And so how do we judge that? Is being a big INGO, a leading INGO, a good thing? I mean, for whom? Right? And I think that one thing that we really have thought about a lot, it comes out in chapter 6, is this trade-off between representation and effectiveness, and how the two can sometimes work together and sometimes, or more often than not, it seems, become mutually exclusive choices that INGOs have to make in their work. So I promised the press I would do this. Here's a 30% off code if you choose to Cornell University Press to buy the book. If you don't buy the book, I certainly hope that you know, you use it in other ways. So thank you so much, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. Excellent. Thank you so much. That was really, really interesting. We will open it up for questions and comments. I will just quickly remind people of the house rule, which is that we ask you to kindly introduce yourselves before you ask your question. And if you choose to make a comment for discussion, please do keep it relatively brief in the interest of letting everyone speak. So who would like to start this off, please? I will. Yes, please.
Could you go back to the slide at the beginning with all your metrics?
At the beginning.
Towards the beginning of all the measures of authority? Because I think one of the things that is interesting
This
is,
one?
yeah, that's good, which is mentions, right? I mean, it's particularly a problem with the first one, not so much the other ones, which is, it reminds me of citations. Measuring somebody's authority by citations is deceptive if everybody cites somebody for being an idiot. And so it could, I mean, now it turns out the way, the groups that you have at the top are the groups that are talked about a lot for a variety of reasons, but it could be that, you know, if NGO X caused an outbreak of diphtheria, it would get a lot of press coverage. But I wouldn't say it had a lot of authority.
Right.
And so I'm worried that conflating hits with authority. And so I'm curious as to your take on that.
Yeah, that's a fair question. And we actually agonized over this a lot when we were writing the book, because we're actually, if you want to get really nitpicky, we're measuring attention, right? Because these are counts. And so there's no judgment as to what the context around those counts are, or whether it's negative or positive. I think the negative or positive one is not, if someone is quoting Amnesty International because they don't like the way that they, you know, care about, say prostitution should be a protected right, then it does signal the authority of Amnesty International. But if it's something like what's going on with Oxfam now, right? I don't know if you guys have been hearing about this. Oxfam has been, or at least some of Oxfam's staff have been accused of using prostitutes in Haiti. So this, yeah, that would get counted in here. So you're right, and so, you know, one thing is that we know these measures are imperfect, and so we are conflating attention with authority. But the logic behind that, I think the large majority of the ways that INGOs are used, you know, like in the news, for example, would be to cite their work, right? So that's one. The second thing is you can't have authority if no one knows about you. So attention is sort of a prerequisite for authority. And yes, we can disagree about that more, but I think that's sort of where we came down, and that's actually what we was in the book.
Hi, I'm Diane Becker. I work in this sector in NGOs. And I guess, so I'm not a policy scientist or an academic, but I'm wondering why they use the word authority rather than effectiveness. Because if you were looking at effectiveness, it's really hard to make change. And when these groups have no money and are up against huge odds, and it's really hard, you know, like you can't go in and make really big demands. You know what they should be, but you push them forward. And different groups break out, like uOttawa, which you used, has a very different approach than Greenpeace. And everybody has a very consciously worked out what they see their theories of change on that. So I just think that looking at effectiveness rather than authority, because authority, the way you describe it, it's almost like they just want to have authority, but you have to have a certain reputation to be taken seriously. And you can't push for what we need, because some people listen to you. So I just find your use of language, I find this a cynical approach.
Yeah, I mean, we can't, I think for some of the reasons you highlighted in your question, using effectiveness is actually a really difficult measure, right? and especially when we're talking about NGOs working in different sectors. So not even, I mean, within sector, we already have lots of variation in how NGOs approach different problems, right? Like the same problem, but like they use different ways, and some of them, you know, tend to do things that maybe are easier to measure in terms of effectiveness than others. I mean, it's one thing to deliver mosquito nets to try to alleviate, you know, some malaria infection. Is another thing to try to change the health system in order to prevent malaria outbreaks,
But
right?
even
So,
to get onto, I mean, Walmart's committee is really hard. I mean, there would be thousands of NGOs who would love to get on and push Walmart for change. And they wouldn't be allowed on because they would be seen as too radical. They wouldn't play like, you know, so there's different levels of effectiveness.
but that's what I mean, is that because we wanted to look at effectiveness of INGOs across sector, and actually just in general, it's really hard to know when an INGO is being effective if they're trying to use different measures. How do you know if one INGO is being more effective than another one? So in that sense,
I just find the new description is cynical.
okay.
And you could use the same numbers, the same information, and just have a.
So why do you think it's cynical?
Because you're saying, I mean, your title of the book is The Authority Trap.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would see that there are NGOs who are really good at taking very little money, very little influence, very little power, and turning it in to getting change. And so I just see that the title itself just pushes one into cynicism.
Yeah, I mean, I could see where you're coming from with that, but I don't see it as cynical. I think it's simply describing the realities that constrain the nonprofit sector in general. I think that you're right. They face a lot of INGOs face very insurmountable challenges, or very high challenges and steep challenges that they make do with, and I think that's an important point. But I also think that you know, the way that INGOs have been seen both in the academy and I think through policymakers' eyes is that then they're this can-do organization that can do all these different things. But in reality, you know, INGOs might have very aspirational principles, and they might actually have even very good you know, ways of doing things, capacity and expertise. But they can't do it all, and there are reasons why they can't do it all, and that has to do with the constraints that they're facing and the nature of the power or the authority that they have in politics.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
going
a
to
much
move
less
on now.
cynical way
Thank you.
of putting it.
Michael here and then Ben.
Good.
Please. No, Ben.
Oh, okay. Well, Dan Livermore, I'm a senior fellow here at the University of Ottawa. What interested me was that your two leading NGOs, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, are both NGOs that I don't think you would say ever veer towards moderation of their assessments or analysis of the situation. In fact, their integrity is built on not compromising their basic goals. So, you know, you speak of vanilla as not pejorative, but I think it has to be pejorative, because you're saying basically you're veering somewhere in the middle. You once had 100% principles, now you're going to settle for something in the middle, a little vanilla. But I think that may, what I'm suggesting is that that probably holds for a lot of NGOs in different fields, but it may not hold true necessarily for all of them. I'm thinking too of organizations like MSF, which if you talk to other NGOs about collaboration, you'd find them at the bottom of the scale, because they don't collaborate with anybody. They have their own operational principles that they tend to stick to when they do their work. So I think there are some variations that fit quite well with your argument, but I see a couple of names in there where I think almost the opposite, that the reason they're prominent and the reason they stay prominent is that they don't fall under the authority trap.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting point, because, you know, when you were talking, I find myself agreeing with you, except I don't. And the reason, so you said a couple of things that I wanted to respond to. the MSF comment, and then I'll go back to the Amnesty and Human Rights Watch. So MSF doesn't play well with others, which is actually why their score overall is not very, quote, good. If you think about like how much they get out of 6 with their normalized scores, it's actually quite low.
Yeah.
And I think this is what we're trying to capture, are these multiple dimensions, these multiple audiences that INGOs have to contend with. So yeah, they're not good at playing with others, they're not very impressive before their peers. And the things that they are known for in terms of media mentions and knowledge from the public, I think they do better, although not as well as we would expect given their reputation. And they're also not the type of NGO who would necessarily be referred to by states. Now, there might be other indicators for state deference that we either that are not systematic or that are hard to capture, right? The thing that in NGO research we want is some state bureaucrat to say, yes, it was because Human Rights Watch gave us this report and that's why we changed our policy in Myanmar, right? But we don't, at least Sarah and I, in all our years of doing this, have not gotten that. And so, so that's one thing. I think, so Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch are human rights organizations. We tend to think of them as having to be provocative, that is, having non-vanilla victories in mind when they're asking for policy change, right? I think that's the right intuition, but amongst their peers, right, they're not asking for the most extreme outcomes. And when they join ING coalitions, for example, with the arms trade treaty, they have to moderate. That whole project got moderated because Amnesty and Oxfam joined that coalition. And I think I think that the effect of these leading INGOs is that when they do come to the table, yes, they have these asks, but they're less aggressive than other INGOs also working on those issues. It's just we know about their asks more because they have more authority, and so we hear about them.
You've already actually answered the question, because there was a program on Radio Canada about Oxfam. Nathaniel A. Raymond, do you know the name? He's a Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. They were doing an interview with him,
Okay.
and he was talking about the sexual misconduct of aid workers in Haiti, as you said. So you've already answered the question, but I thought I'd mention that. He was working for Oxfam, this man. Do you know him? I mean,
No.
no, right. Nathaniel A. Raymond at
Okay.
Harvard Humanitarian. I don't know him.
Okay.
Nothing. Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. The program will probably, I mean, the radio program will probably repeat tonight at 8 o'clock.
Okay, that's great. Thank you.
I mean, you've answered the question that Oxfam, if it's involved with their employees, I guess you'd say, if they have that reputation, obviously the authority of the organization will be reduced, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think this is a great test case of the strength of the theory. And so I brought them up, but actually, in reading the news, I was thinking that someone might ask me about this, so I thought about what I would say. Look, Oxfam is a leading INGO. This is a pretty big scandal. So the biggest consequence, well, there are two big consequences. One is general public perception of Oxfam and its quality. So is it burnished now? The second one is the DFID funding, right, from the UK government. The DFID has said we will re-evaluate our funding of Oxfam. So I would like to see in the next funding cycle if that's true. Right? And even if it's a temporary, okay, this year we're punishing you and we're not funding you, is it the next time that they apply that they get the money? Because DFID is a major funder of Oxfam UK, Oxfam GB rather. So, I think it's a great test, right? So if we're right, then yes, it'll affect them, of course. This is not small and inconsequential, but it's not likely to affect them in the long run, and that's where the authority is durable, right? It's not that it's unassailable, but it's, they'll probably be able to pull through for other reasons. Plus, not to mention the fact that Oxfam is a bunch of sister organizations, and so it's not just one part of Oxfam. It's a lot of Oxfams together.
I suppose that this person was doing damage control a little bit. I mean, this Raymond, sort of saying we lose Oxfam, is doing its best to find solutions to these kind of things.
Yeah, exactly.
Please.
I have a couple of questions. My name is Ted. I'm a veteran of 4 decades of humanitarian business operations. Authority arising from the audience. Could you tell us about the qualitative aspects of audience, like media and other things? Getting authority from a questionable audience is a question of authority. The second question, with NGOs that have chosen or denied seeking authority and are more focused on delivery and impact on the beneficiaries on the ground. What did you find?
Okay, so we didn't distinguish INGOs in that way, actually. So in that sense, we treated them all the same, whether or not they're primarily known for service delivery or advocacy. The reason we do that is because if you're interested in affecting global politics, at some level you have to do some advocacy, even if your primary function is delivering services. You're still needing to report on what you do, and there's a certain consciousness of publicity for your cause and for yourself. So we don't distinguish.
Advocacy for the institution or advocacy for the beneficiaries?
Both. As for the characteristics of the audience, I think that's a fantastic question. So one thing that we didn't do a good job of in this book is distinguishing within audience, right? So we come up with these different audiences that matter to INGOs, but we don't talk about the qualitative differences within. And initially I think we had wanted to, but then it's a little bit hairy in the theoretical framework. In the cases, we kind of get into it. So, for example, leading INGOs tend to associate with middle powers. And the reason they do that is because middle powers kind of have a little bit more wiggle room to work with civil society. They're less constrained than great powers or more powerful countries, but at the same time they matter, and they're seen as a barometer for where global politics is going. So they're not going to lead the charge, but if you don't have Finland, Canada, and Norway on board, you're not going to get very far, right? So I think that's a really good question that gets at the heart of further extension of this question. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Jen Allen. I'm a postdoc at Cornell now. But first I should thank you, because I think I emailed you about this time last year when I was finishing up my dissertation, and everyone said I needed to talk to you. You were very kind, so thank you.
That's great.
I'm wondering if there's any patterns between different types of authority, like expert-based, capacity-based, moral-based, and either the audiences. So is it that INGOs use expert-based authority when they speak to states and moral-based authority when they speak to the public, or vice versa? And were there any sort of influences of that in the 3 strategies, collaboration, combination?
So what we're trying to do is slightly, so if you look at, for example, Yvonne, Finmore, and Cell, what they're trying to do in that book is establish reasons for why you have non-state actors having governing power in global politics, right? So there are all these different logics. We take those logics as given. We basically say, for whatever reason you're deferring, it could be anything, right? So you could say that some people or some organizations might defer to INGOs because of, for what I would say is cynical reasons. It's because, if we don't, Walmart doesn't include WWF, well, WWF works a lot with the US, so US government or whatever, they're seen as a positive at INGO, or pro-care is. So that helps establish us as credible, right? It could be that. It could be that they think that WWF and CARE are simply the best in what they do. So we don't actually analyze that. We're interested in then what happens as a result of deferring. So the logics for deference could be many and complicated or completely unreasoned, right? I think actually, in some cases, I think, generally speaking, how do people find out about INGOs? Is it that they get approached by someone on the street corner while they're waiting for the light? Is it because they read a newspaper story? Is it because their friends are part of the organization? Right? So in that sense, we don't theorize too much about that. But certainly, I could definitely see, INGOs trying to project themselves or establish their expertise before like a specialist agency versus like Congress or Parliament or something like that. They use a different type of emphasis on their work.
I had a question that was similar but different, which was, could one distinguish between what kinds of audiences are most important to different NGOs? So are there NGOs to whom, say, corporations don't really matter at all, or states don't matter, or the global public matters less? So is there a way in which, because you treat all the audiences as, at least in your, you treat them as equal, which
Yes.
I can see the logic, but it would also, I mean, when I think about INGOs, I wonder if there's some that are ignoring some of those audiences and what the implications might be.
Mhm. Yeah, so exactly. So in the book, we assume that every audience is of equal importance because we didn't want to privilege any of them. But it's true that some INGOs might think that certain audiences are more important than others. So MSF has come up. Clearly, they don't think that their peers are as important of an audience as other audiences. So they make a strategic decision about that. Other groups like Civicus, for example, or BRAC are very well known before their peers, but not as well known among other audiences. And so they make a strategic decision about that. Now, I think the big question here is, okay, so they've made this decision, and neither of those organizations I've named are very old in the sense they haven't been around that long. So maybe they're just trying to establish themselves before one audience, and then if we did this again in 50 years, they will have established themselves before the other audiences as well. I mean, that's a possibility, right? So I don't know, and that's one of the limitations of this book is that it's a snapshot. Right? And we know that authority is dynamic, we say it, and then we present you with a bunch of static descriptive statistics. This is sort of a tricky thing we do. But, at the same time, we couldn't think of another way to effectively show this. And I think any analysis that's done is always looking backwards, right? So we always kind of know back then this is what happened, but maybe, after this time, after this significant time, that would have drastically changed, but we can't know that until it happens, right? So I would say that, I think each individual INGO makes choices about which audience is more important, and I think that we used to, in international relations, as scholars, we used to think, oh, well, obviously states matter more. But we actually know that states are not the only target for INGOs, and maybe it's just taken academia a long time to catch up, but the truth is a lot of INGOs never approach states, and they don't have to. Right? They're either engaging sub-state actors, local actors, or they're just empowering individuals, or they're telling businesses to stop their horrible practices, and it has nothing to do with governance and regulation from the state.
Well, at one point, when they described the book as a snapshot, I think if it's a snapshot, it's an exceptionally rich snapshot. Did you have another question, Michael? Sorry.
I have a question.
A question.
And I haven't had a chance to ask a question yet. You confused Dan with me or?
So before I wrap up,
Yeah, I have a
final
question.
question.
Michael's turn.
I have two questions.
Oh, Michael Williams has two questions.
Thanks for that, Wendy. I have one really simple question, but that I think might actually have a rather complicated answer. But just to ask it in a really simple way, can you explain the Salvation Army status to me here in your numbers? And does that tell us a little bit something about the question that was asked earlier about how you're counting up here?
Yeah.
Because if I think about audience mentions in the Salvation Army in Ottawa, it's around homelessness, right? You almost never read an article on homelessness that doesn't mention the Salvation Army. So I'm kind of wondering where the Salvation Army pops up, or am I just ignorant about all the things the Salvation Army does?
Yeah.
The second one is, I understand that, and I think I really understand what you're trying to do here in terms of creating an aggregated field, right, in which the totality of these things work.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious about the extent to which you could see kind of sub-field effects and how much those matter. And I'm thinking here about some work that Rita and I once did on the engagement of Canadian NGOs with Canadian mining firms in development, right? Mm-hmm. In which there was a big push by the government to team up mining companies and NGOs to do development work. And some of the NGOs argued this is exactly what we ought to do for exactly the reasons that you're talking about there, right? This gives us access to all these important audiences, to resources, et cetera, et cetera. A whole series of other NGOs said this is the work of the devil, right? And if you actually do this, you are no longer really an NGO. You've plunked in our minds a line within our field. Did you find those kinds of effects operating, or does that not really matter in terms of their global authority? Or is that a question you just didn't look into, which is also
It's not a
possible?
question I thought about in those words.
Okay, yeah.
Right. Yes, I think a lot of times we think the same things, but in different words, right? So
Yeah.
I think, this is, it's also about sector, right? Because I think that the environmental sector, NGOs in that sector have been pretty savvy about working with corporations compared to the human rights field, which is only just starting to think about that, I think. And the relief and development field, which I think has largely gone independently of more privately funded, not private, they're all private, but excuse me, for-profit enterprises, right? So, I think the interesting stuff in the relief and development is the social enterprise corporations, right? The ones that are trying to combine social good or environmental good with some sort of profit model. So, yeah, I think it has something to do with sector. I think the corporate INGO relationship is very fraught, and I do think there are INGOs out there who would just never think about it. It would not occur to them, and even if it did, publicly they would still reject that. So Rainforest Action Network, I think, is the one that pops in my head, and Greenpeace, actually, that reject corporate collaboration most of the time publicly, but they do it. There are partnerships, and they're just not as publicized, right? So I think that's something I've been curious about and want to think more about. The Salvation Army one is a puzzle. It's a huge puzzle. And that's actually what makes this exercise really fun. If it was all a bunch of INGOs we all knew and expected, it would just be, I don't know. I think it'd still be important, but it'd be kind of boring, right? But the Salvation Army is like, what explains that? I think it's an artifact of our metrics. I think if we did it differently, they might not show up. But the Salvation Army is an important Anglophone organization, and they're pretty good at being a source for things like homelessness and poverty. And they're old, right? So people know of them. That's something I didn't talk about today. But it takes time to become a leading INGO rather, and a lot of our INGOs are not young. Some of them are. You can certainly become important before one audience in a relatively short time. So like the Carter Center is very important to the US Congress, and it's not very old. It's been around for maybe a few decades. But with the Amnesties, the Oxfam, Save the Children, these are pretty Salvation Army. They're established, and I think that's what's driving it. I think the newspaper mentions they'd also be driving that. Let me just look really quickly, actually, at their other scores. Yeah, so they do really well in Google searches because people know of them. You mentioned the whole media. Before US Congress, they're more popular than before Canadian Parliament, but they don't do well with their peers. So what that score is showing, it's largely driven by two audiences, right? So you can get these kind of effects, and sometimes, this is why we don't use the raw scores, because in some of these, like Rainforest Action Network, they are scoring so high on one indicator that it actually throws off how you would interpret the raw score, right? So we had to sort of normalize them, so it makes sense in context. But the Salvation Army is a real puzzle. IR people should look at the Salvation Army. That's what that tells you, right? So, yeah.
Great, thank you. Thank you so much for coming. I think the nature of the questions and the engagement really shows that there is a lot to explore. As you say, there's so many different angles one could take. And I think what you've given us today is exceptionally rich and interesting. So I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and thank Wendy Wong in particular for coming and giving us such a great talk. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody.